The paralysis of the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue is not a sudden diplomatic failure, nor an accidental lapse in scheduling, but the predictable outcome of a deeper structural contradiction between alliance logic and multipolar reality. The Quad's current silence, especially following the return of Donald Trump to the White House and the simultaneous warming of India China ties, exposes a fundamental truth about the 21st century geopolitics. Partnerships are not underwritten by aligned economic incentives, and asymmetrical discipline mechanisms cannot sustain strategic momentum. What appears on the surface as a temporary pause is in reality a stress test or whether the Quad can exist beyond a rhetorical convergence and episodic coordination. The Quad was never conceived as a formal military alliance. Its origin in the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami response framed it as a humanitarian and logistical arrangement rather than a security bloc. Even its 2007 reincarnation under Shinzo Abe emphasized a free and open Indo-Pacific, stopped short of binding commitments. This ambiguity was not a flaw, but a feature. It allowed India, Australia, Japan, and the United States to cooperate without forcing India to abandon its long-standing doctrine of strategic autonomy. Yet this same flexibility was also planted the seeds of fragility. Without enforceable obligations, the Quad could only function as long as external pressure, chiefly China's assertiveness, created sufficient overlap in threat perception to hold the grouping together. The revival of the Quad in 2017, often referred as the Quad 2.0, was driven by precisely such a convergence. China's Belt and Road Initiative, militarization of the South China Sea, and growing naval presence in the Indian Ocean alarmed Washington, Tokyo, Canberra, and New Delhi simultaneously. However, even at this stage, the four members were never aligned in intensity or intent. The United States viewed the Quad as part of a broader commitment architecture. Japan saw it as a stabilizing hedge against China's dominance. Australia oscillated between the security alignment and economic dependence on China, and India treated the Quad as leverage rather than allegiance. The seeds of divergence were even were present even during the moments of apparent unity. The transition to what some analysts describe as Quad 3.0, with its emphasis on development, health, security, climate initiatives, supply chain, and critical technologies, was an attempt to institutionalize cooperation beyond overt military signaling. Yet this shift was diluted as the Quad strategic clarity declined. By broadening its agenda, the Quad reduced the immediacy of its original security rationale, making it more vulnerable to disruption by bilateral disputes among its members. When economic conflicts arise, especially between two large partners, the absence of a hand security mandate leaves the framework exposed. This vulnerability became acute under Trump administration's renewed tariff offensive. The imposition of a combined 50% tariffs on Indian goods, justified by trade imbalances, agricultural market access disputes, and India's continued purchases of Russian oil, marked a decisive shift from a strategic patience to economic coercion. Unlike previous administrations that tolerated India's non alignment as a price of long term partnership, Trump's approach treats deviation as defiance and autonomy as ingratitude. The accompanying restrictions on H-1B visas disproportionately affecting Indian professionals were not merely immigration policy adjustments but targeted signaling aimed at India's elite economic class. From Washington's perspective, these measures are rational. Trump's foreign policy is explicitly transactional. Alliances were evaluated based on immediate domestic returns rather than the abstract strategic alignment. If India benefits from the access to to the US market, technology, and visas while simultaneously hedging through BRICS participation, Russian energy purchases, and cautious engagement with China, then India must be compelled to choose or pay a price for refusing to do so. The Quad, under this logic, become conditional rather than foundational. India's response, however, reveals a different strategic calculus. Rather than capitulating or openly confronting the United States, New Delhi has doubled down on hedging behavior. Modi's engagement with China at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit, his rhetoric framing India and China as development partners, the revival of economic exchanges with Beijing following tariff shock from Washington are not signs of ideological realignment. They are risk management maneuvers. India's economy remains structurally dependent on Chinese intermediate goods, particularly in electronics, machinery, and industrial components. Decoupling from China is neither feasible nor desirable in the short or medium term, regardless of border disputes or geopolitical mistrust. At the same time, India hasn't abandoned its partnership with the United States. Bilateral trade volumes remain substantial, defense cooperation continues, and strategic dialogue persists. What changed is India's willingness to absorb economic pain rather than surrender strategic autonomy. This reflects a deeper shift in India's self perception, no longer content to function as a balancing state with a US led order. India increasingly views itself as an independent pole in a multipolar system. Non alignment, once a Cold War necessity born of weakness, has evolved into a deliberate strategy of leverage enabled by scale, market size, and geopolitical relevance. The warming of the warming of India-China economic ties must therefore be understood as a reconciliation as well as compartmentalization. Political distrust, border tensions, and China's partnership with Pakistan remain unresolved constraints on any deep strategic convergence. Yet, economic interdependence persists because it serves India's growth imperatives and provides bargaining power, vice versa, compared to the United States. The surge in Indian exports to China following US tariffs illustrates how quickly economic flows adjust when geopolitical pressure shifts. This is not loyalty, it's arbitrage. The Pakistan dimension further complicates the Quad's paralysis. Trump's overt engagement with Pakistan includes claim of mediating India-Pakistan tensions and hosting Pakistan military leadership directly undermines India's perception of US reliability. For New Delhi, Pakistan is not merely a rival but a revisionist adversary whose elevation by Washington carries symbolic and strategic costs. Even if the United States views Pakistan pragmatically as a lever in regional stability or counterterrorism, India interprets such engagement as a delusion of its status and a betrayal of implicit alignment. The Russian factor adds another layer of complexity. India's continued purchase of Russian oil and cautious maintenance of defense ties with Moscow reflects both material necessity and strategic memory. Russia remains a legal supplier of defense systems and a source of discounted energy during the global price volatility. And when India has signaled restraint by avoiding long-term commitments and major new deals, it has not severed ties. This balancing act frustrates Washington but aligns with India's broader doctrine of autonomy. Against the backdrop, the Quad's paralysis becomes intelligible. The framework lacks the institutional depth and coercive mechanism to override bilateral conflicts between its principal members. When US India relations sour to tariffs, visa, Pakistan, and Russia, the Quad concept cannot function as a countervailing force because it is not designed to discipline its members. Japan and Australia, despite their efforts to sustain momentum through naval cooperation, infrastructure financing, and health initiatives, lack the strategic weight to bridge a rift between Washington and New Delhi. In alliances without a clear hierarchy, the largest actors set the tempo. Yet declaring the Quad dead would be premature. Neither the United States nor India has an interest in formally dismantling the framework. For Washington, the Quad remains a symbolic and strategic asset in Asia, referenced explicitly in official security documents. For India, the Quad continues to offer diplomatic leverage and access to advanced technologies without binding into commitments. The current silence reflects caution rather than abandonment. The future of the Quad hinges on whether the United States recalibrates its approach from coercion to accommodation and whether India can craft an agenda that aligns Quad cooperation with its autonomy rather than against it. A mutually accepted trade agreement, modernization moderation of of tariff disputes and reduce friction from over visas, and Pakistan could restore functional alignment. Absent such adjustments, the Quad will persist only as a nominal structure, invoked in statements, deferred in practice, and activated selectively when interests converge. Ultimately, the Quad paralysis illustrates a broader transformation in global order. Multipolarity erodes the effectiveness of rigid blocks and rewards states capable of strategic hedging. India's behavior isn't anomalous but adaptive. The United States, under a transactional administration, seeks discipline rather than patience. Until these logics reconcile, the Quad will remain suspended, neither collapse nor cohesive, but waiting.